Ben, Matt, great to have you both on today. How are you doing?
Good morning. We're good. How are you? Thanks for having us.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for coming on the podcast. I'm doing well, enjoyed my weekend and now back at it for a busy Monday, including a great podcast with y'all, which I think is going to dig into some really timely issues, which are developments in Chinese tariffs and how that is going to affect chemical distribution globally. And I know the chemical company is in charge of distributing a lot of different kinds of chemicals that affect a variety of industries, which I think is really important for understanding, how these tariffs are going to affect you in a variety of different ways. So why don't we start with that, with a little bit of info on the chemical company. I'd like to know, both for me and for our audience, what sort of chemicals do you distribute, and what industries are they a part of?
Yeah, so the chemical company, we're a bulk chemical distribution firm founded and still headquartered in Jamestown, Rhode Island. We were founded by Nick Roach, who's currently the CEO, and his son Rob Roach is now the president and oversees a lot of the day-to-day now with the business. So proud to be family owned, and we have a great group of people and great organization up here in Rhode Island. Yeah, as you said, we're a bulk distribution firm. So we operate globally, definitely within the U.S., Latin and South America, with some operations in Europe and Asia as well. And we have a satellite office over in Nanjing, China. So we operate, our biggest product line by volume is plasticizers. We're also big in oxo alcohols. We do some with the agricultural field as well. So a lot of different stuff. We do a good amount of business with China, and we're always looking at Chinese imports, which is obviously why the tariff implications could be pretty large for our business specifically. But we are pretty well-rounded and do operate from Europe, Canada, Latin America, South America, as well as obviously U.S. operations too. So we're obviously monitoring the situation closely, and we're happy to have Matt Francor sitting here as well, monitoring a lot of the regulatory stuff, both with China specifically and otherwise. So he's been a great asset to TCC, and we're happy to have him, and obviously excited to be on the podcast to talk about a little bit and see what we're seeing.
Absolutely. So I'd like to know a little bit more about that relationship with China. How long since the chemical company has been around has there been that line of trade with China? And what has that relationship been like? What kind of chemicals are you importing from China? And why are they seen as such an important partner in this trade?
China's always been important, I think, in the chemical industry. Obviously, both myself and Matt are 25 and under age-wise, so obviously Rob and Nick have been around a whole lot longer in the industry. But China's always been an important partner, for sure. Obviously, one of the big ones for us is dicyandiamide, important because there's no other producer. But China's always had business operations where they are able to produce a variety of different chemicals at a low cost. So I think the convenience of a low cost and relatively easy shipping in and out. It is obviously takes a good bit of lead time to get over here from China, but it is based right on, coastally. So there is that ease of transport via vessel. So I think it's been important for a lot of reasons. I think Nick and Rob knew that it was important a little while ago and obviously set up that satellite company. We have 2 full-time staff over in Nanjing, China, primarily working with vendors and manufacturers and producers over in China. So we have that pretty ease of communication with China versus it can be a little bit difficult sometimes dealing with a variety of different manufacturers over here in the US. So they're a great asset for us. And I think these tariffs might change the global landscape of how important or unimportant or where China fits into that distribution strategy and that manufacturing strategy for a lot of chemical companies. Obviously, I think they're not going anywhere. They're always going to be a player and a big player at that. But I think these tariffs could definitely change that landscape, and it'll be easy to see kind of where the dust settles and how that ends up.
Definitely, yeah. And I'm really interested in seeing what the effect of these tariffs is going to be on that relationship. So let's dig into how these tariffs specifically affect the distribution of chemicals, especially for the chemical company. Now, I know there are different kinds of tariffs that were proposed by President Trump, and they affect different kinds of products. Some of them, and most of them actually, don't even affect the distribution of chemicals, which is, I guess, a relief. So, Matt, could you dive into a little bit of the different tariffs that are coming through and why it's important to understand all the different kinds of tariffs and not just the ones that are going to affect distribution of chemicals?
Understood. Yeah. So to kind of kick it off, I think it's important to draw a distinction between the two main categories of tariffs that have been published. The first, you heard the steel and aluminum tariffs that happened. I think it was back in January to March. Those are based on Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, which gives legal authority to impose tariffs based on national security interests, and that, falls largely under the discretion of the president. And the ones we're talking about here today are Section 301 tariffs, which fall under the Trade Act of 1974, which allows the U.S. Trade Representative to open investigations and make rulings on unfair trade practices. These investigations can be opened by the U.S. Trade Representative, industry petition, or the World Trade Organization disputes. And these happen to be opened by the U.S. Trade Representative in response to intellectual property theft and Made in China 2025, two pretty large issues on the grand scale with China, and ones that have been not addressed so much in the past. So under the Section 301 tariffs, I'm sure you've heard of there's three lists, which can also be called a tranche. List 1 is a 25% tariff on about 820 items from China. That one is final and in effect, and it really doesn't affect the chemical industry too much, like we said before. The bulk of are sections 84 through 90 of the tariff bill, and include electrical and mechanical machinery, which really have a large effect on the automobile industry as well as agriculture. The second of which you'll see is kind of a big theme of these tariffs. The agriculture industry has been very adversely affected. List 2 is also final and in effect. It's a 25% tariff on 280 items from China. It was effective as of August 23rd, so fairly recently. And it contains 279 of the original 284 tariff lines. And there was a tariff line reduction because there are, I think, almost 1,000 industry comments, not support, in the kind of fighting and petitioning these tariffs. The only other recourse that industry has besides that is a product exclusion request, which for list 1, there's a deadline of October 9th, so that's coming up pretty quickly. Again, for the chemical industry, not terribly important. In list 2, that effective date or the product exclusion request deadline has not been published yet, as far as I know. And really what it comes down to for us is list 3, which is 6,000 items from China, which is substantially larger than the other two. And it also includes, or it affects $200 billion in business with the U.S. and China. It's extremely heavy on chemicals, notably in sections 28, 29, and 38, which to us means organic and inorganic chemicals. And so far, like I said before, we've identified 21 of TCC's chemicals that are imported from China that are listed on there. The notable one is diazine diamide, which is only produced in volume in China. And like I said before, important for agricultural applications.
And that piece with China too, with diazine diamide, correct me if I'm wrong, obviously you know a whole lot more of it than I do. But the point of the tariffs is to give the advantage or not give an unfair advantage to a international producer. So with diazine diamide, it almost doesn't make sense because there is no U.S. producer that we could be taking profits away from.
Exactly. That's exactly it. Which, I mean, in cases like that, which are, from my point of view, seem a little bit few and far between, which is good. It does really negatively affect American business and, the agriculture industry as a whole. Sure. And for list 3, it's kind of interesting. It was originally proposed with a 10% across the board tariff, but there have been, kind of rumblings and with interviews with President Trump talk about moving it up to 25% across the board, which, difference between 10 and 25% where you're bringing in hundreds of thousands of dollars of worth of chemicals with each shipment is massive.
Sure,
it's a huge
absolutely.
difference.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I find it interesting that this is in a response to Made in China 2025. And, clearly the point of that is to make sure that there isn't an unfair trade advantage with that international partner and that, we aren't that relationship isn't stepping in the way of Made in America or, in our personal business interests. But like you said, it's interesting that with that chemical, which is one of the biggest chemicals coming out of China, and it's only produced in China, it seems odd that the tariff would affect that chemical when there isn't any sort of American producer. So why do you think that chemical, which is so important to the agricultural industry in the United States, is now going to have a tariff imposed on it. And how do you think that that is going to affect the agricultural industry in the States?
So with 6,031 products, obviously, I don't think someone sat there and analyzed each product for an hour to make sure that, this was a good use. So obviously, I think that's where these retaliatory comments and public comment hearings come in. And that's why the process works so well. I think hopefully a lot of people that play with dicyandiamide or import it or use it however they might would be hopefully one of the ones that, if it goes through the process and goes correctly and all the facts are correct, that hopefully will be taken off the list, because there is no domestic source that we're competing against. Matt, you obviously might have a better reasoning or better thought process behind how that might have ended up on the list. But from someone who kind of has a high level understanding of everything going on, that would be kind of my 2 cents.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head right there. I mean, you look at list 1 and 2, with 818 items on list 1 and only 280 on list 2. You can definitely see that they cherry picked a little bit more what products would specifically affect, Chinese production. And I think with list 3, what you see is the majority of 3 sections, including chemicals, just being included. So it looks like someone kind of copy pasted from the from the tariff document. Yeah.
And I think it's important to note too, obviously the chemical company, we're primarily in bulk distribution. We don't produce or manufacture or blend or anything like that. But we are, one of the players in what's often a pretty long supply chain between people actually producing the product over in China, coming through us, who we sell to a customer who then might be another customer or a distributor or whatever the case might be. There's a pretty long supply chain. So even though we're not an end user, we're not actually producing product for an end user, or, we could, depending on the end use of it. It's important for everyone all the way down the supply chain. I mean, it's going to increase costs and be a different accounting function and kind of that whole thing that we've never seen before, all the way down the supply chain. So it's not going to affect anybody more than anybody else. I think, a 10% increase is going to be a 10% increase all the way down through the end user, who likely will be, hit the hardest, depending if they can raise their prices to accommodate or not.
Right. And let's say the end user can't raise their prices to accommodate. What would that effect look like?
Yeah, and that's a situation that's come up a couple times already with speculative conversations, depending on what may or may not happen. There are situations where certain end users might have to set prices for a year or 6 months, or they might have to do contracts, or a big box retailer might make them give them a 6-month price quote. So it's definitely happened, and I think there will likely be some people that unfortunately end up getting burned just by the way that it is. I think everyone is understanding of it and appreciates kind of the, I don't want to say craziness, but it's kind of a poor word for it, but it is kind of a crazy situation where it's something that no one could have foreseen. So unfortunately, I assume some people will unfortunately get burned by it, but I think that might be a little bit rare of a situation. I think in a lot of cases, unfortunately, prices will go up. It could negatively, or I guess positively, impact inflation and things like that. So I think there's a lot of speculation to be had, and it'll be interesting to see how things really settle. Probably more on a case by case basis, depending on the end user and the different industries and how things operate on kind of the back end pricing side.
So with list 3 having so many items on it, I think everyone can be sure that there's at least going to be some reduction. Are there any other items on that tariff list that you can point out, or that you remember that might have a large impact, maybe even outside of the chemical company's reach? Some chemicals that have a huge market here in the United States that are very important to their industry, and that placing a tariff on them might affect the balance of things.
Yeah, I think definitely one can draw attention to is adipic acid, which we're really seeing a tight market here in the U.S. And there was production recently opened up in China and expanded in China. And it's extremely important to the plastics industry. And that one is actually under list 3 as well. And I think that, for a little bit there before these tariffs were announced, you could expect a little reprieve in that industry. But now it's definitely really negatively affecting it. And I think people are starting to look for other sources outside of China.
Yeah, and I'm sure there are plenty of products that are large scale and are used in a lot of different stuff. It may just not apply to our business. Obviously, with 6,000 products, we kind of have to pick and choose which ones we're monitoring closely and seeing what's happening on and trying to leverage one way or another. I'm sure there's tons of products that are used in incredibly bulk quantities that are going to impact things. And I'm sure there are situations where there's people buying things that are 2 or 3 processes down the supply chain, and product 2,418 may have a 25% tariff now, and now all of a sudden that their end cost 2 or 3 steps down the supply chain is going to all of a sudden be 25% higher. So in some situations, I'm sure it's probably difficult for a company, even if they wanted to monitor and see what's going on. If they're buying 10 products and each of those 10 products has 10 things that go into it, it's difficult to monitor 100 different products 3 steps ahead of the supply chain. So it'll definitely probably take a little while to shake all the way down and have people informed on what's going to impact them or not, especially as we kind of don't know 100% yet. So I'm sure there will definitely be some case-by-case confusion and some large-scale products absolutely that are going to be included, that'll shake up big supply chains.
That's it. Yeah, it's thankfully it's not all doom and gloom. There was recently got repassed was a miscellaneous tariff bill act, which is passed every couple of years. I don't, barring that the House or Senate have an issue with it. But what it does is it takes products that are important to U.S. production, and really they take three things into consideration when they consider putting a product on there, that it can be administered by U.S. Customs and Border Protection, which means the reduction in tariff is easy to implement, that it doesn't exceed $500,000 a year in reduction, so tariff reduction, which would equate to revenue loss for the U.S., and it's non-controversial, meaning it doesn't hurt American business interests, so stuff that's not really produced in America to begin with. And that list includes, I think, about 1,500 products, and a lot of them are chemicals, and it affects 2 of ours, to name them. It's dimethylmalonate and monopotassium phosphate, which are pretty big in the grand scheme of things for TCC. So it's great to see a tariff reduction there. It was verbally passed by the Senate back in on 7/26, so was that July 26th, and the House agreed to Senate amendments just a few days ago, and it was presented to President Trump on September 6th. So we're waiting for a signature on that. So with the kind of House and Senate fighting back against these tariffs here and the concern for American business interests, it's really great to see. And I'm hoping that other chemicals or other companies see a bigger tariff reduction than we do. For us, it's 2 out of our 21 products that are affected by the tariffs in the first place, which is, it's not nothing, but I wish it was more.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note too that there are some pretty good checks and balances, which is obviously, as we all learned in our elementary school history classes, what the U.S. government's built upon. So it is good to see, and I think it's been interesting being not so involved with it, but just sitting next to Matt, who's incredibly involved with it, and seeing these checks and balances that take place between the tariff bill and each chemical or each tariff list having a comment period and a rebuttal period and a product exemption period. It's good to see that there are the checks and balances. There are the opportunities to have your voice heard if things are going to severely and negatively impact your business. So I think that's important to note too, that there are all these good processes, and hopefully companies and people out there are taking advantage of those to have their voice heard.
And those 2 chemicals on the miscellaneous tariff bill, could you walk me through their applications and their importance in the U.S. market?
So it'd be really great to have salesmen for those here. I can't say too much for myself, but I know that I think it's monopotassium phosphate, which is one of the ones I referenced earlier. It's largely only produced in China. It has a large effect on American business. And I wish I knew the applications exactly for you.
Yeah, and we do sell, we have probably 40 or 50 core products, and then a lot of them that are a little bit on the smaller scale, at least for us. They may be large in different business applications, but for us, they're a relatively small piece of the businesses we're operating in. But that's not to say that it's not going to either positively or negatively affect companies in other situations. I'm sure, we get approached all the time for companies looking for massive volumes compared to what we've dealt with in the past, just because it's not a real big one for us or a real strong one for us.
So what I'm hearing here is that there are a lot of these chemicals that are solely produced in China that are getting some tariffs lumped on them. And clearly, like, list 3 has over 6,000 items on it. So like we've mentioned, it probably wasn't that cherry picked, or the list wasn't mapped out that in depth. It was like kind of slapping everything on and then doing some revisions afterwards. But, it sounds like a lot of these products are still getting tariffs, even though they're only produced in China. And so that gets me thinking, do you think it's valuable to even produce some of these chemicals in the United States, locally? Do we have the skilled labor force for it? Is that something that could be seen as a solution to this issue, or should the solution just stay with, okay, we need to keep these products being imported from China and figure out the best sort of trade deal to make that continue to happen?
Yeah, I would say that it's an option for certain products. There's going to be certain things that I'm sure will shift to production in the U.S. or over here. But I know there's a lot of products included on the list are produced in other countries. So a lot of them are produced in Europe, throughout Asia, some in either South or Latin America. So it may not be a matter of increasing production necessarily elsewhere, although we obviously will need more capacity if these plants either slow down what they're producing, or even we've seen some just come to a halt because they can't eat the 25% increases for whatever reason. So we definitely will probably see increased capacity, whether that is in the U.S. or elsewhere. I think it's just going to depend on a product basis. There's some stuff that might have some pretty severe regulatory issues with hazard materials or toxic materials. I'm sure that's the case, as I'm sure Matt could elaborate more on. The other thing I think we'll likely see with, if a product's big in China and all of a sudden there's a 25% increase on that price from China, more than likely we would assume producing partners and manufacturers from other geographical locations are just going to add 20% just because they can to stay competitive. So it's going to be interesting to see if that is the situation that ends up happening or not, and kind of what may shift over to the U.S., what may shift elsewhere, other geographical locations. But it definitely will be an option, and I'm sure we'll see increased in at least some capacity, because that extra or lost capacity needs to go somewhere.
So I guess to follow up on, the environment, boils down to environmental regulations. China obviously has been, getting more and more strict on the environmental side, but still a lot of these chemicals are pretty nasty to produce. So that's a reason that they can be produced in China in the first place. And I think it's hard, it's really hard to say whether or not the American businesses will consider moving the production to the States, just because the amount of infrastructure and the cost of it to begin with is huge. And I think for something as temporary as tariffs can be, it might not be a safe investment for some American companies. I think Ben, again, hit the nail on the head that if there are other sources abroad or in the U.S. that we can turn to, that's probably what we'll do, rather than, starting up new production. Sure,
yeah. I mean, the infrastructure alone would probably put these companies out millions and millions of dollars. So if the potential that, the miscellaneous tariff bill might cut or reduce some of those tariffs, even if that's an inkling of a chance, I'm sure that will be the more appealing option than saying, all right, well, time to just produce in-house.
That's it. Yep. And I think it's a lot of hoping and waiting for that. And, like I said at the beginning, there are ways to combat the tariffs, not just through stuff like the Miscellaneous Tariff Bill Act. There's the product exclusion request, which, like I said before, had been dropped for list 1, but not for 2, and certainly not for 3, because that one has not been finalized yet. But, right. It's an opportunity for American business to state exactly, why they need these products, without tariffs on them.
And it almost seems like these regulatory bodies that are putting out these lists are hoping and expecting companies to put in these exclusion requests and things like that, because I think the people producing these lists aren't experts by any means on all 6,000 products on this list. So they're going to kind of put things out there and see what happens. There might be some that there's companies have no problems with, that that it is what it is, but I'm sure these regulatory bodies appreciate the comments and expect the comments. And I think that's, from what I've heard from the work Matt has done with submitting these comments on behalf of TCC, is to make sure you're doing it and take advantage of all opportunities to have your voice heard, because it's almost expected. It almost seems like, and it is an asset. It's not just submitting something that goes into some mailbox somewhere and never actually gets read. So it seems like It's been an important part of the process.
Right. Yeah. It's important to have that open line of communication. And it's definitely beneficial that, at least from your perspective, you feel like those concerns are being listened to and they're not just being tossed, or it's not just a formality, that there actually is an authentic conversation there about, we don't want to screw anyone over here, making sure that some of those products that are only produced in China don't retain a 25% tariff or something large that could heavily affect the market here in the United States.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, but all those comments that are submitted by anybody are publicly available as well?
Yeah, they are. So if you go, it's called regulations.gov, and you put the docket number, which for list 3 was USTR-2018-0026. If you're interested in going to look, you just read all those comments, and a large majority of them are from businesses. Usually it looks like one per business, but I guess different departments might put their own in as well. But I've seen some interesting ones from just private citizens who are commenting, some in support, some against it. And I think it's just interesting that those might be viewed as the same. So a CEO submitting a comment might be the same as, Joe Schmo.
So the last piece I want to hit on is looking a little more ahead at the future of these tariffs. So we are seeing some finalized versions of the Section 301 tariffs. List 1 is final and in effect. List 2 will become effective in August 23rd, I believe. And then List 3 will likely be effective in October. So there's still some leg room here. The product exclusion request deadline for List 1 extends through October 9th. So there's still some leeway here as to what is actually going to have that 10 to 25% tariff on it. So, looking towards the future, especially with List 3, since that's not even in effect and there's still the product exclusion request deadline for it, that could extend for several months of unsuredness around what's actually going to have a tariff on it. How do you think that might affect trade and business? Just that mystery, that foggy cloud around everything. Do you think that'll have an effect on it, that uncertainty, or will people charge ahead as if nothing has changed and then just sort of, pray for the best?
I think it's incredibly hard to, give an across the board answer for something like that. But I think it, does give a kind of sense of hope to industry still that they can, retain these products and not have to, God forbid, drop a line or something like that, which would be, it could affect a business pretty greatly. And like you said, we're waiting on a finalized version of List 3. And the 3 things that really can be affected on that final version are the lines to be included. So far it's 6,031 lines. And, there have been 6,000 comments. So we might see a reduction, really. But the ball here is in President Trump and the U.S. Trade Representatives Court. On an interview on Air Force One, President Trump said that, he's kind of waiting on China. If they see anything substantial come out of them that's positive for the U.S., who knows, there might be a large reduction. And if there's movement in the opposite direction, such as, more retaliatory tariffs on their part, then I'm guessing we'll see, a high tariff percentage as well as all of those lines being included. And there's also talk of a potential List 4 that covers $267 billion in products, which is, it's crazy. That's huge.
Yeah, that's quite a lot.
Yeah. So. I think on the business front too, we were just down at a trade show last week in South Carolina and talking to a lot of companies and mentioning, if they had heard about it, if they're thinking about it. And I think we've heard everything from companies that have some very specific, concise processes for how they're going to handle it. Hey, we're going to add these 3 invoice tiers on there. It's very clear what you're getting charged because of the tariffs. And, if they don't come into effect, we'll refund you, whatever that accounting function is, all the way down to, we have no idea what's going on. We're just going to wait and see. So I think you're seeing everything in between. I think some companies are better at monitoring it and preparing for it. Some companies are just kind of waiting and seeing. But I think there's no being behind. I think everyone's kind of in the same boat. Everyone's just as confused or trying to figure out what's actually going to happen, or just trying to do the best they can with what we're seeing and preparing for all situations, anywhere from the maximum proposed tariff percentages all the way down to, nothing happened and this just being kind of a crazy whirlwind that nothing came out of. So obviously no one really knows what's going to happen. And it's going to impact different businesses very differently. Some products might be included, some might be not. Some companies could have everything included. Some companies could have nothing included and just it doesn't even affect them. So I think we're just kind of waiting and seeing for these last couple of weeks to see how things shake out, and we'll see some more formal processes from there.
I think that's part of the frustration, is that you don't know what is going to have a tariff tacked onto it until you see the list in front of you. It's just so difficult to predict, which I think in a way sort of makes you on a business perspective have to continue headstrong and not really let it boil up and frustrate you too much. It's just kind of like, okay, we don't really know what the what the final tariff list is going to look like. So might as well just charge ahead like there are no tariffs to be proposed, and continue sending in those product exclusion requests, and do your part as a business to sort of prove, why this product shouldn't have a tariff on it, instead of making a rash decision that, might turn around and bite you in the back.
Yeah, I think on the TCC side, our approach has kind of been to just be as clear and open as possible. Obviously we have our own podcast series that we've been talking about the tariffs for quite a while now. We do our monthly newsletters and put stuff up on our website and things like that, just to give people all the information that's available and kind of what we're seeing. And Matt's done some great work with monitoring it and producing different documents that have some really good, concise information, and just trying to say, hey, here's all the info, here's how we have it, here's what we're seeing. Feel free to contact us if you have questions. Otherwise, just, check it out, follow along, see what we're seeing, and we're happy to help and make recommendations and discuss kind of what's happening, at least from our eyes. Obviously, we're not experts in tariff law, or at least I know I'm not. But just trying to be as open as possible and sharing information that we're seeing and sharing, as much as possible to help our customers and business partners make as informed decisions as possible, because that's really, I think, all anybody can do at this point.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Well, Matt, Ben, I want to thank you both for coming on the podcast and helping us break down this sect of tariffs. So many different effects that are going to come through the pipeline here, but it's at least hopeful to know that there are methods to counteract some of these tariffs that may have a really drastic effect on chemicals being distributed through the states. So I'm excited. I'm a little nervous, but mostly just keeping an eye on how this evolves, especially with the possibility of the list 4 coming around the corner. And I mean, you mentioned $267 billion of tariffs. That's pretty intense there. So it's just keeping fingers crossed and looking to the future for what that might mean for chemical distribution. But I want to thank you both for coming on and giving us this breakdown of what's already in effect, what might be in effect soon, and how businesses might or should react to these potential tariffs.
Yeah, I appreciate you having us. I know definitely enjoyed sitting down this morning and talk about it and seeing where things are at. And we're I guess looking forward to seeing how things shake out and continuing to monitor the situation.
Yeah, I think it'll be a busy next few weeks here.
Yeah, it seems that way. We're making Matt earn his keep this month. So.
All right. Well, thanks again for coming on the podcast.